I'm going to get going. We are in week 6. We're going to be covering ground covers and vines this week. But I also took a few pictures in my yard today just because the fall color in some of the plants was so gorgeous, and because I wanted to give you an idea of just how quickly some of these plants can really grow. So we're going to get going. Let me just wake this baby up. There we go. All right, so that's me this morning in front of a crepe myrtle. And where you see my hand is about the size that that crepe myrtle went in at. Um, I chose to be economical and pick something that was shrub size, knowing that it would grow into a tree. And you can see just how gorgeous the fall color is on this tree. I don't believe that I have crepe myrtle in your group, but we do have juniper. We have the Juniperus virginiana. And so just behind that crepe myrtle is a juniper that went in 2008, so 17 years. And no kidding, it was a seedling that wasn't even a foot tall. It was maybe 6 to 8 inches. And that evergreen that's back behind that crepe myrtle has really grown and grown fast. It's really a beautiful um, covering to my back utility area. Unfortunately, I do have a very sloppy mess of pine needles and straw because we are reinvigorating the lawn right now. We had a lot of well, thanks to my dog, we had a number of places where she was digging, and we did need to do some things to fix up the lawn. And so now is really a good time to be doing that. This next one, again, where my hand is, that is a willow oak. My sons gave that to me for my 60th birthday. I'm now 68. So in 8 years, that tree that started that small, just maybe a little over 3 feet tall, and it was a bare root tree that had come by mail from my guys, and it's topping out at about 20 feet in just 8 years. It's beginning to take on its really nice fall foliage, which is a pretty clear gold, which is quite nice. And then these are just two more things that are showing their fall glory in my garden. On the left-hand side, we have the native dogwood, the Cornus florida, and it's really very vibrant. And on the right-hand side, we've got a winterberry holly. This one is Maryland Beauty that I put in. And this just kind of shows you the transition that this goes through. Before it drops its leaves, it's going to become a really nice clear yellow. It's beginning to show that yellow. And then well into the winter, it's going to be holding those berries. Now, not all winter berries are created equal. There is a group of them that were bred by the United States Botanical Garden, I believe it was. And it's called sparkleberry. And the berries are small and they are extremely prolific. The only drawback that I see with the sparkleberry is that those berries are so small that any of the berry-eating birds gobble them up really, really fast. So sometimes you don't make it really well into the winter. A lot of times, as the fall migration is happening, they can really get cleared off very, very quickly, which is part of the reason why I chose Maryland Beauty. Maryland Beauty winter red, winter gold, red sprite, all have larger berries. So what happens with that larger berry is like the robins and the bluebirds, which love the berries of this plant, they can't, it's too hard right at the beginning of winter. It takes a number of freezes and thaws for those berries to become malleable enough for the birds to be able to eat them. And then whatever is left by the time the spring migration comes back, those bushes they get cleaned off at that point. So just something to think about as you are planning gardens, whether it's for yourself or for someone else. These are important little bits of information to know.
Nancy,
I, yeah,
sorry, we have a question in the chat. If you
okay.
can explain more about what moist or well-drained soil means. For example, is the low wet area on your property well drained?
Um, no, it's not. Water can sit there. If we have a lot of water, that water will sit there for probably 2 days before it goes away. So not all low spots are created equal. It's a really good question. I have very heavy clay soil around my garden, and in that low wet area. Now, okay, as I'm saying this, you don't have to exactly mimic what is happening in my garden. What you do need to do is choose plants that can tolerate some moisture. All right. If I had it to do over again, I probably would have added more compost. But at the time when I started that experiment, we were just in the early stages of doing our compost piles. And for us, what we do with our composting is we have one really big bin that is for this year's stuff. Grass clippings, uh, the tomatoes that we just finished taking out of the vegetable garden, leaves, that all goes into this year's pile, and that's a much bigger group. Then that gets turned over into the next year's pile, which is much smaller because, especially over the winter, this all compresses and begins to break down. Then that middle group gets turned into year 3. There are many different ways to approach composting. But at the time that I started experimenting with rain garden plants, we didn't have a lot of compost handy, and I hadn't learned as much as I know now. So if I could go back and do it over again, I probably would have worked more humus into the soil. Rain garden plants, the plants that are labeled that way, and you can find lists of rain garden plants. They are plants that tolerate periodic inundation of water. And we did talk about this earlier in that plants breathe through their roots as well as through their leaves. So many plants can't handle having water standing there for a day or more. The rain garden plants can. And they are things like the perennial hibiscus, the clethra that we talked about, the native iris. There are a lot of them to pick from. Buttonbush is another one. So there are a lot to be able to pick from. But when it comes, I I have had a lot of questions, a lot of emails from you all, um, and very concerned about taking in the viewpoints from the house. I added the windows. I only added one door, the front door. You have leeway, okay, to do whatever you want with this property. Don't be constrained by what my existing situation is, okay? I want you to be able to put the plants that like it high and dry up in the corner where it says high and dry. The plants that can handle being wet some of the time, put them in the low and wet spot, okay? Um, in the whole lineup of this series of classes, this is supposed to be an earlier one. So if you haven't had a lot of um, classes about hardscape and that kind of thing, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. What I really want to see from you is that you're putting the right plant in the right place. Does anyone have any questions about that aspect?
There is a question about from all the plants that you cover, can they choose any cultivar from those plants?
You can. So if I showed you, for instance, Coreopsis verticillata, and I mentioned Zagreb, but there is another verticillata called Moonbeam. And if you already know that, you can do that. The thing is, you do need to use the genus and species that I gave you. That's what counts in the 25. If you want to add more than that afterwards of other plants that you know and like, by all means, go ahead and do it. But this is what I'm going to be grading on, is how much you've taken in the information that I've given you on these plants. Okay, that's really what you're being tested on. A lot of times, I have seen some really beautiful landscape designs from professionals. And a lot of times they major on the hardscape aspect and not so much on the plant knowledge. So as I've said before, the goal of this class is to give you a toolkit of really reliable plants that you can use to plug into information. And by all means, take other classes, learn more about the plants, because the plants are what really sets off the beautiful hardscape. And you want to be providing for your customer rugged, reliable plantings that are going to dress up their area that you're landscaping for. Okay. I learned a lot of my lessons the hard way. I moved to Delaware in 2001. Really didn't want to move here. I moved here because we needed to take care of my mother-in-law. And so I inherited a property that was a third of an acre, that was a number of ash trees and a lot of lawn. And I saw it as a blank space. And I think I've already told you, I created a maintenance nightmare for myself by opening up 5 different perennial beds, which required a lot of maintenance. And I learned along the way. 2004, I went through master gardener training. And that was really my first step into learning a lot of basics, or cementing basics about the biology of plants and what's going to be successful. 2007 is when I was hired at Gateway, and Gateway encouraged us to take classes at Longwood. And boy, did I ever take them up on it. I took every single class that I could take here at Longwood, and I learned a ton. I have some real favorite teachers that I'm still in touch with, and I'm really happy to be a teacher here for that reason. Um, Longwood has amazing gardens and amazing teachers, and hopefully you will learn a lot from this. Okay. Are there any other questions before I move on?
There's one more question, going
Okay.
back to the composting discussion you were having. Um, they asked, do you find that you get volunteers from the tomatoes you compost or any other plants that you add?
I typically I will have either a squash, a pumpkin, or a tomato that chooses to grow out of my compost pile. And I do try to work around it and let that volunteer be there. Um, Occasionally, yes. Most of the time, there are very few volunteers that come up in it. And I will say, um, when you're looking at composting, I don't worry about putting tree leaves in there. But if I have had a particular problem with, say, powdery mildew, which I did have initially on the peonies that I inherited, um, I don't put heavily diseased leaves into my compost pile because I don't turn the pile regularly. I'm 68, my husband is 67. Um, we are beginning to look at this big thing that we turn every year. We only turn it once a year. We're getting old, and turning the compost pile isn't as easy as it once was. Okay. You can go online and find all kinds of recommendations for how to do composting. It is recommended that you turn it more regularly than we do. And that creates more heat in the pile, which helps to kill any of the seeds and any of the diseases. So that being said, I don't put heavily diseased leaves into the compost. Anything else? Okay. So I'm going to touch on deer resistance. This is a book that is fairly recently came out. Greg Tepper and Ruth Clausen worked together on putting together really resistant plants to deer browse. These are native plants, and this is situated for the Northeast. If you're not exactly in the Northeast, a lot of these you can probably make educated guesses. Okay. Um, I'm Greg gifted me his book. So I'm happy to have it added into my collection. But beyond that, I also have, this is the website from Rutgers Cooperative Extension, Rutgers University. And they did a really good job of evaluating plants that are typically used ornamentally, again, in this region. All right. And so this is what their website looks like. All you have to do is Google Rutgers deer resistant, and it'll take you straight to here. This is a picture of further down that page. Okay, so they list the plants by common name because they are trying to appeal to a regular audience that may not know all the botanical names. But they rate them A, B, C, and D as to A is rarely damaged, D is it's got problems with deer. So I include this in here to give you again another tool to be able to look up and get some information from as you move forward into more into the horticultural aspect of doing your landscape designing. Are there any questions before I move on? All righty. So our first plant in the ground covers is the carpet bugleweed, Ajuga reptans. This can be a really good sturdy ground cover. Because it's semi-evergreen. So not all ground covers are created equal. There are some that are dense, like some of the creeping thymes, for instance. But because they lose their leaves in the wintertime, there are these gaps of bare soil. And weeds tend to fall into two loose categories, winter weeds and summer weeds. All right. And they don't all fall into those categories, but generally, there are things that are going to germinate and come up in the course of the wintertime. And some of them are really a pain in the neck. But something like this, the Ajuga reptans, its basal foliage pretty much stays in place. So it is still shielding the soil and keeping the sunlight from hitting that soil, which is what helps to germinate some of the weed seeds. They typically have these blue flowers. They can be a little bit more purple or pink or white, but that's more unusual. More typically is this kind of blue color. Now, the one that you're seeing right now is a variety called chocolate chip. There is one called black scallop, which is even a darker color. The darker leaved varieties, I think, work best if you've got them near a walkway where you can really see that dark color. If you have it like to the back of an area, that dark color in the shade just doesn't show up. It just becomes a dark hole. And you don't see it, you don't appreciate it until you're right up on top of it. So this works really, really well. The darker ones, if you've got them up near someplace where you're going to see them. These do best in part sun, so that would be the morning sun and then afternoon shade, or they can be put into shade. They will be slower to spread out and do the ground cover aspect that you want them to do. The next picture, this is one called Rosy Glow. And this one you could certainly use almost anywhere in the garden. And because it's got that really bright, light variegated foliage, it is going to show up and have a presence more than the darker leaf varieties. But there's quite a range that you can find and pick from. And the flowers themselves are pretty when they're up there. It blooms for probably about four to 5 weeks, I would say. And it moves out slowly by stolons that just kind of move across the surface of the soil. When you are planting ground cover kind of things, you need to make sure that your mulching is very, very light, okay? You want to make it easy for these plants to move out and literally become the living mulch in the area. Our next one, I like this one. This is the wild ginger. It's a native, Asarum canadense. Now, this does lose its leaves in the wintertime, but as you can almost see from looking at the density of the leaves, it is very dense at the root level. So you don't really get a lot of weeds coming up in the middle of this. It really works quite nicely. And let me see. Yeah, okay. I'm going to go back for a minute. The flower that it has is kind of a cup shape. It is actually fertilized by a slug. So it doesn't have attractive flowers at all, not showy at all. but it does move out steadily and densely. So it does become a pretty effective ground cover with very little coming in. Now, this is what I wanted to show you. So the leaves have almost a satiny look to them, which is really quite beautiful in its own right. And here you see in this picture, it is pine needles that have been used, which the pine needles really allow for this plant to move easily and breathe easily through the roots. It's a very ideal mulch to be putting down um, around this kind of a planting. Are there any questions? All righty. You know, if you have any as we go along, you can put your hand up and I will pause and also um, Leanne is going to help as well with monitoring the chat. So, but if you put your hand up in the comment thing, I'll be able to see it and know to pause. This is another pretty cool plant. This is Ceratostigma plumbaginoides leadwort. This picture shows what this plant is doing right now. During the growing season, it has a very glossy leaf that's quite beautiful. And starting about end of July into August into September, it has these blue flowers that are really vivid. And those flowers continue even after this begins to take on its fall color. It does lose its leaves, it loses its flowers. So it can have some weeds springing up in between it. Given enough time, though, this can become really dense and be a really durable ground cover. It can take occasional stepping on it. Not a lot, I mean, you wouldn't want to have it be on a pathway, but it can take the occasional stepping. It does best in a part sun situation, but it can be pushed into light shade. You're going to lose the plant if you push it into a really deep shade situation. It's just going to slowly give up the ghost. And this is what it looks like during the summertime, end of summer, actually, the August, September timeframe. Really very nice. The foliage is really clean looking on it. A nice medium green, and then those blue flowers just really jump off. Another one, this one is really pretty durable. This is Chrysogonum virginianum. It's a native. It's also called golden star. And this is dense, 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 dense. It does lose its leaves, but because as it moves out, it's moving out densely, it crowds out other weeds. There really isn't much that's going to get in the middle of this. It does have nice gold flowers that are going to happen. They're going to happen a lot in late spring, like coming into June, but then you'll get this sporadic blooming happening over the course of the summer. And that sporadic bloom really is, it's going to happen after it's got some rain. So it just responds to whatever's going on around it in the landscape. A really nice, durable, tough plant. It can make a really nice edging. So it makes a really nice edging because the plant itself doesn't get much higher than this. So we're talking like 3 inches max. So it's a nice step down when you come to like along a driveway or a sidewalk or a walkway. It can be that really nice filler. And this is a close-up on the flowers. Really quite nice. This is earlier, like this is probably in June, okay? that's when it has its more full flowering. But then again, like I said, there's going to be sporadic blooming happening over the course of the summer. Epimedium. Now, I learned this plant as a shade plant. And much to my surprise, when I did further checking on this, it really is a full sun plant and it can be pushed into shade. So when I first planted it, it just kind of slow, slow, slow. It was at the roots of a pretty mature maple. And when that maple came down, and it had to come down because of disease, all of a sudden, what was there exploded with growth. Okay. It is very dense. Where it occupies, it occupies it pretty fully. It's not evergreen, it's semi-evergreen. And it's it's a real goer. So I'm showing you the Epimedium rubrum. There are a lot of hybrids. There is another one that has a yellow flower. And then with the hybridizing, you get some of these flowers that are bigger than others, some that have like, so here you can kind of see the flowers are kind of dangling down. Some of them with the hybridization are now holding their flowers up a little more sturdily. But it's a really good ground cover. This actually, my crazy dog, goes running through the back area along the fence where this is, and this plant actually is able to stand up to the abuse that she gives it. It's a really reliable, sturdy plant. And this is just a close-up of the flowers on the rubrum. They're very delicate looking, but the plant itself is pretty sturdy, surprisingly so. Galium odoratum, sweet woodruff. This is a part to full shade plant. Part sun, part shade is where it's more ideal. This is one of those ground covers, though, that when it dies back, you may get weeds coming up in the middle of it. It is fragrant. It spreads kind of slowly, steadily. And it can become quite dense. It does not do well being trod on. Um, it doesn't take dogs or people walking on it very well. But it can be a really good plant to fill in the space. So, if I don't do bulbs in this class, but fall is the time for planting bulbs, like the daffodils, um, the tulips, the crocus, those kinds of things. This is a really good companion plant to those kinds of things because it will fill in the space that they have taken up in the springtime. So in that kind of situation, it can be a really nice filler. It is very fragrant. And again, the foliage is really clean on it, and those white flowers just pop off of it. But it's more of a late spring, early summer bloomer. And then the rest of the time, you have this nice, clean green foliage happening. Euphorbia. This is Euphorbia amygdaloides variety robii. This is wood spurge. There are some other euphorbias which I think are really nice as well. This particular one can take part to full shade. and it becomes very dense. It's evergreen. So one of the nice things about it being evergreen is wherever it's going to spread to, it's going to occupy that space year round. Now, the bright green that you're seeing is the flowers, and they happen April into May, and they last for a long time. Now, euphorbia is the same family. Excuse me a second. There's still pollen and mold out there that gets the back of my throat. It's in the same family as poinsettias, and so it has a milky sap. Any of the euphorbias, you want to be really careful when you're working around them, because if you get the sap on your skin and you don't get it cleaned off, and your skin is subjected to sunlight, you can get a burn. You can get a really bad burn, because it just really magnifies the interaction of the sun on your skin. So you really want to be sure when you are handling this plant that you have long sleeves and gloves, just to make sure that you don't get this phytodermatitis that can come up from it. But very deer resistant, and a real goer in even in very rooty soils. Like I have seen this going for years, at the Gateway office at the base of a really old juniper. And so there's a lot of dense root competition, but this plant does really well and really behaves itself. And this is this is in a brighter area, as you can see. So the coloring on this can be lighter. There's another variety that's been out for probably, I think I first came upon it maybe 12 years ago, and it's called Ascot Rainbow. And the foliage has shades of gold and green and red. And it behaves pretty much the same way as Robii, but it gives you a different color palette to be able to pull from. There are some other spurges. One, the common name is it's called donkey tail spurge, and it's a blue. And I do have it in my front garden. It does want to move around a little bit from seed if I let it go to flower. But it doesn't seed in aggressively. And I do like incorporating blue into my garden. So the euphorbia as a group is very drought tolerant, and very versatile as far as the amount of light that it can take. This is an interesting one. And with this one, I'm going to challenge you with what you think of as ground covers. So a lot of times we tend to think of ground covers as being really low. This one isn't low. This is Jasminum nudiflorum, or winter jasmine. It does very well in zones 6 to 10. So Pennsylvania down to Florida, it'll do quite well. But it's really wiry. Now, this is a picture of it being taken from a wall. And so it's draping over the wall. It's a really good use for this plant, actually. It needs to be in full sun, and it needs good drainage for it to do really well. But it blooms in February when nothing else is really showing. It's just this bit of brightness in the middle of winter. It does lose its leaves. The leaves are very tiny and held all along these stems, but because the stems themselves stay a nice deep green, It has the presence of an evergreen. And then with this joyous flush of flowers in the middle of winter. Now, this plant, when you get it, is probably going to be in a 1 gallon size container, so about that big. And probably hanging over that container, maybe 6 to 8 inches. This plant, everywhere that it touches the ground, it kind of moves out from there. So it can begin to colonize a space very nicely. So if you've got a dry section that you want to put something that has a lot of presence and then a brightening in the middle of winter, this can be a really cool plant. It's not really well known. And a lot of the plants that we tend to use, some of the shrubs that we use, for instance, like the boxwoods or the Japanese hollies, essentially, they're ground covers too, just at a higher level than what we typically think of as ground covers. And this is just a close-up of it when it's in its full glory and blooming. The length of bloom really depends on what the temperatures do, but this is at least a 4-week bloom out of this plant, and sometimes it'll go longer. If we're in a mild winter, it'll just keep on going, which is really quite nice. Liriope. A lot of people are familiar with liriope, and there's not all liriope is created equal. This is Liriope muscari. So Liriope muscari is a clump former. So it moves out at a slow, steady rate. It typically has flowers that are violet or blue, and it blooms at the end of the summer. Okay. But the foliage is evergreen. It has a very nice presence and texture. The deer typically leave this plant alone. It can be grown in full sun. It can also take partial sun or even moved into a fair amount of shade. It's really pretty easy to grow. It's important to know, okay, that this is a clumper. Now this is it's relative. It's the Liriope muscari variegata. So it has green and gold variegation in its leaves, which really add a nice brightness to a shade or a part shade area. And we move on to Liriope spicata. When I first started at the garden center, we would carry both Liriope spicata and Liriope muscari side by side. When I became the perennials manager, I stopped carrying this one. I was happy to order it in for people, but what I found was that people couldn't distinguish, customers couldn't distinguish one from the other. Liriope spicata runs, and it can run really quickly. So it doesn't stay in one place very nicely. It can be a thug that overruns its neighbors and then can be difficult to remove. So one place where I saw it used to great effect was a bed that was created around a really large rock, and they gave it an edging so that it stayed in that place and it didn't run out into the grass. And it was really quite beautiful because it was dense and it had a different texture than the grass. It didn't compete with it. But this really, it can be a nightmare, okay? Especially if it has um, a, um, a soil that has a lot of humus in it, that's lighter. than say a clay soil. The clay would slow it down, but it wouldn't stop it. That's for sure. This is just gonna, the easier the soil is to move in, the faster this thing is gonna run. And this just kind of gives you the idea. I mean, this can be an excellent, excellent ground cover in a difficult situation in the root zone of a tree. But like I said, you need to give it a boundary. Um, Otherwise, it just really is very difficult to maintain. This, um, this is a very low shrub. It only gets really max somewhere between 12 and 18 inches tall. But it has this really graceful kind of arching texture to it. It's evergreen. It does best in a bright light situation. It does not want to be in full sun. It can be in full sun if it's got regular moisture. Otherwise, it dries out. But this plant is very beautiful, very lacy in its texture. The deer usually leave it alone. It does in the wintertime take on kind of a bronzy tone. Um, some people don't like that color. Um, they see it as looking dead. It's not dead. It just becomes much more bronze in the cold temperatures, but it works really well on slopes. Um, because it's evergreen and because it's fairly dense in how full it is, it really does a pretty good job keeping the weeds at bay. So it can be a really good possibility on a slope that's difficult to manage. And this is it in spring. So really nice, fresh green. And like I said, it does become somewhat bronzy, but you can really see the laciness of it. Um, it's a pretty plant, and it was used quite a bit when I first came into the industry, and it seems to have fallen out of favor. But it's still really good, really useful, and very reliable. Okay, Pachysandra procumbens. This is our native Pachysandra. I did not go into the non-native because certainly in Delaware and in a number of surrounding states, if it's not on the invasive species list, it's on watch lists. So I've gone with the Allegheny Pachysandra, which is our native. It is evergreen, but it does kind of flatten out over the course of the winter. And its leaves, in here you're seeing a really nice green. In the springtime, the leaves can be, they can have a little more brown to them and some speckling. They do get white flowers that emerge in the spring. It's not as fast moving as the non-native. It's a slow, kind of steady colonizer. And where it does fill in, it does a really good job. And there's a picture of it in the springtime with those flowers. And you can kind of see there's a little bit of marbling or speckling on the leaves themselves, but a really good native ground cover. And I think, yep, I'm going to stop here. We're going to take, we'll be back at 7. And we're going to go into more plants, but I'm also going to show you some other resources that I want you to be aware of. So see you in 10.
Nancy, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure, sure.
So I had Siberian cypress, and I planted
Uh-huh.
them under a red maple. I put 3 of them. They were in an area where they got sun in the morning, but then in the late afternoon, it was partially sun, mostly like part shade. And they just did not thrive. Do they need a lot of moisture?
They need more moisture than they would get under a maple. Maples are notoriously thirsty plants, so you
Ah,
really have to use more drought tolerant plants. That Siberian cypress, it's a really nice one, but it doesn't take competition for moisture really well.
okay.
All
So
right.
if I watered it by like if I continue to water it specifically, would it do okay, or should I just move it out of there
I
altogether?
would move it. I would move it because this need for moisture that the plant has, it's not a moisture hog, but it needs pretty consistent moisture. And when you've got it at the roots of a mature maple, it's always going to be in a deficit and it's never
Okay.
going to fulfill the promise that it actually has for you in your garden.
Okay, thank you. Do you have a recommendation of something similar like that for that space I
Um,
could use? I don't know what to put there.
I would say that the wild ginger
Okay.
that I showed earlier,
Mm-hmm.
the Pachysandra procumbens can
Okay.
also do well in that situation. And a number of the ferns can do really well.
Okay. I do have ferns under there. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm sorry. I don't mean to take up your break.
No,
Thanks.
no, no, it's fine.
I
It's
appreciate
fine.
it.
No
Okay.
problem.
Thank you.
Anybody else, or I'll take questions when we come back, okay? We are back. Like I said, I try to give you more than just the plants. Some of the things that I learned, like I was a plant walk instructor here at Longwood for 7 years. And in that um, role, I would be going out with students into the landscape to look at mature plants. But also in some of the botany classes, I would be a support person there. And quite frankly, the botany classes that I listened in on and then assisted with really rounded out a lot of my understanding of the plants. And it makes it easier to kind of understand when to do what. So, for instance, pruning is a whole big mystery to a lot of people. And pruning, you know, the basic wisdom is that fall is the time to prune. Well, it is a good time to prune certain things. So as you learn more about plants, keep in mind that things like pruning, and this is what your customers would be asking you later on. There would be follow-up questions as to how to maintain the things that you recommend putting in their yard. Anything that blooms in early spring, like forsythia, rhododendrons, lilacs, you do not want to cut them in the fall. If you do, you will be cutting off the flowers that have already set. Hydrangeas. There's like 6 different genuses that are readily available on the market. There's hydrangeas serrata, macrophylla, quercifolia, paniculata, arborescens, and they aren't all the same. Some are very forgiving of when they are pruned, like the smooth hydrangeas and the paniculata hydrangeas. They bloom on new wood. So as you move forward, learning more about plants, try to keep in mind that they're not all created equal, that you've got to, especially with the spring bloomers, you really have to figure out when it is they're going to be blooming so that you're not shooting yourself in the foot and cutting off flowers that you really want to have. Unfortunately, the spring bloomers, they need to be pruned immediately after flowering before they set their buds. So that means that you're pruning them in growth season, okay? And where that potentially becomes a problem is out at the growing tips of trees and shrubs, there is a growth suppressing hormone called auxin that the plant makes. And I think I've said this already. The plant is making its own energy in its leaves through the process of photosynthesis. And it doesn't want to grow in an unregulated manner. It needs to be striking a balance between making energy and using energy. And it costs the plant energy to make flowers. So for those spring bloomers, you have to get on them immediately. And ideally, you are choosing varieties that are the right size for the place so they're not overgrowing and taking over the space. Okay. A lot of the evergreens, really, you want to prune them in winter because the cold will put them into winter dormancy. When you prune them in the cold season, the plant isn't going to want to grow because it's not in full tilt growth mode. It doesn't do that until the weather warms up. So you get your best growth control on things like boxwoods and Japanese holly by pruning them in the winter. Okay. It's something to know. It's not something you're going to be tested on for this class, but I do think it's an important piece of information for you to try to figure out with the plants that you are going to be using and know how and when they need to be taken care of. And ideally, you are choosing cultivars that are not going to overgrow the space. I do have a number of customers who have the large leaf hydrangeas, and a lot of those large leaf hydrangeas bloom on old wood. So the pruning of them is difficult as to know when to do that. So what I recommend that they do is if the plant has already gotten too big for the space, I tell them to take a third of the biggest stems and cut them all the way to the ground. That leaves 2/3 of the plant still left to bloom. And then the following year, they can do the same thing. Take a third of those stems down. And that way you can get control back if a plant has overtaken the space that it was originally planted in. Hopefully that makes sense to you, and you will go on and learn more. So there's always something to know in this industry, which is part of the reason why I love it, because there's just always something cool. Now, okay, this was sitting quiet. There we go. All right. So I mentioned to you about Mount Cuba Center. And for native plants, they really are a really good resource for finding what does really well in the Mid-Atlantic region. And I'm sorry for those of you who are not exactly in the Mid-Atlantic region, but some of what they've discovered may be beneficial to you too. I hope it will be. So this is a picture. I went to Mount Cuba's website, and then I clicked on the research button. So this thing right here. After clicking on the research button, I get to this page which talks about the trials that they have done on different groups of plants. And this is just showing you, okay, you can, so that over here on the left is the Vernonia, the latest trials that they have done. But then over on this side, on the right-hand side, you can access all of their trial garden results. It's all available as a PDF. So it's downloadable and it's free. And I'm just going to go through the list of what they've already trialed. And they do it for 3 years. And trialing these plants in the same conditions that would be more like a home garden. So you find out which ones really are true and reliable. So they've done Vernonia, Amsonia, Carex, wild hydrangea, echinacea or coneflower. They've done 2 separate trials on those, one in 2007 and the other in 2018. Helenium, they did phlox for sun and phlox for shade. Monarda, Baptisia, Coreopsis. They even did a trial on annual Coreopsis, Heuchera, and Aster. And the Carex just reminded me. The question I had right before we left about what could work under a maple tree, the Carexes that we did last week, in addition to the ferns, they can cope really well with the dry shade there. So I'm glad I got to that. Okay, so this is what it looks like when you download the PDF. So this is the one on echinaceas. This is the most recent one that came out in 2018. But then when you look over here on the left-hand side, they began about, I think 6 or 7 years ago, they started tracking. They had volunteers who track the number of pollinators that visit these plants. And what they do is they take like a ring about like this, and they hold it in an area and they count for however many seconds how many pollinators there are that visit in this ring. And so they get a pretty accurate count of who and what is coming in and doing the pollinating. So here, with those, with that information, they were able to determine which of the coneflowers were better for pollinators. So for some people, for some customers, that's an important aspect that they want to be planting for. If they, you know, if they're raising bees, they're going to want to know that information. And this is just showing you the overall results. So this tells you what works and what didn't. And over here, these are plants that didn't complete the trial. So the trial went for 3 years, and these plants just didn't make it. So I used these synopsis when I was the perennials manager and was doing the buying in those areas, in that area. Because I didn't want to bring in plants that were going to fail. Okay. I want my customers to be successful. And I have had my own go rounds with, like there was a coneflower called After Midnight, which I had to put in because I love that song. So that was my excuse for buying it and putting it in. And it died on me twice in an area that really it should have done well in. And yeah, I didn't put it back. I've got other ones that do really well. And so this is research that is actually at your fingertips, that's accessible to help you make informed decisions as to what goes into a garden. And then this is just, this is another one of those charts that they gave out showing the pollinator visits. And with all the hybridizing that's been done, not all of these coneflowers are created equal when it comes to preference by the pollinators themselves. And for like every trial after this, and maybe, I think it was maybe starting 2 years before this, they started because people were asking, what are the best ones? What are the best plants to put in for the pollinators? And, you know, because people asked, grassroots people asked, we've got that information now. And so it's a really good thing to have. And before I go into the next group of plants, I had a couple of people ask me in emails about the scale of the drawing that you're going to be using. And basically it works out to 17.5 feet per inch. That's essentially the scale that you're going to be working with. 17.5 feet to 1 inch gives you the pretty close, pretty true sizing to work on. And I will go into this more next week, but there will be a Dropbox for you to put your drawings into, as well as you can just flat out email it to me. Whichever way you want to do it is fine, okay? I think the Dropbox is probably the easiest answer to that. So, but we'll go into that more next week. Okay, our next plant, Pachyra aurea or golden ragwort. This is a very sturdy native ground cover. It is a part to medium shade plant. It can take a fair amount of moisture too, okay? It can take dry to very moist and do really, really well. It blooms for a long time in the spring. The foliage, the basal foliage of it stays, doesn't get much bigger than this. In moist areas, it can get up to a foot, but typically it's more like 6 inches. And then the flowers are held up above that. So the flowers can be like 2 feet, 2.5 feet tall, and very beautiful, very sturdy. And it does go away in the winter, but because it is such a dense mat, it really does a very good job of being a ground cover in a part shade to shade area. And this is one of my customers' places. That back, let me use my arrow. This back area is where this is planted all around an oak leaf hydrangea. That area is pretty shady and there is a lot of moisture competition, but this plant does really well. And it's just really cheerful in the springtime. Phlox stolonifera. This is creeping phlox. It's evergreen. It is a good perennial. Now, the growing information says that it gets 3 to 6 inches tall. That's about where the flower is held, okay? And they can go up to 10 inches tall, but typically this plant scrambles across the ground. It has kind of wiry stems, which are evergreen. And one of the things that I recommend people do when they're trying to get it established and they want it to spread on out is if you take a large paper clip and you bend that paper clip back and forth so that you end up with 2 U's. You can use those as kind of a landscape pin to hold some of those wiry stems to the ground and guide them out into the area where you really want them to go. It's very fragrant, but it's because it's low. You don't always get to appreciate the fragrance unless you're in there working around the plant. Like if you're on your knees, doing some weeding or whatever. It takes a while for this to fill in enough to become a really good dense ground cover. It takes it a while. But it's really good and very beautiful. The flowers are typically white, pink, or blue on this, or like a blue purple. But a really good goer. And this is just showing you, this is what it's like when it's dense. It's really very attractive. And it blooms for a good 5 to 6 weeks in the spring, which is a long time for a perennial. And then we have the Phlox subulata, which is called moss pink. This is another one that's really, really low, doesn't get much more than 6 inches tall. And as you can see, this one is called Candy Stripe, this particular variety. This comes in a blue, a pink, they call it a red. There's, I see it more as a deep pink. It doesn't read as red to me. There is like salmon and there's light blue. It is semi-evergreen. So, but when I say semi-evergreen, it doesn't go away. It's like, when the cold weather sets in, it's like the chlorophyll begins to retreat into the stems. But the structure of the plant, which is still really dense, is still there. It just isn't green. So it is a very effective ground cover for full sun. All right. And it moves out slowly and steadily. It has a good 5 to 6 weeks, sometimes 7 in the springtime, which is really very nice. And that's just another variety showing you the pink, but a wide variety of colors that this comes in. Solomon seal, Polygonatum odoratum variegatum. This is really a very pretty one. This is a part shade to full shade plant, but this is another one. I told you about the epimedium, the barrenwort, that when that maple tree came down, had to come down. This was in that same general area. And this plant, I guess because it was already established at the root system, it exploded with growth. It moved on out and really filled in very, very thickly. This gets about 2 feet tall, very graceful in the way the stems arch, and these flowers are held underneath it. But this particular one, the variegatum, the variegation on the leaf is really nice and clean. It's a clean white and a clean green. And it forms a stand that's really, really very nice. And it is fragrant. This is also nice to cut and bring in and use in flower arrangements too, because that arching nature of it and the fragrance that it brings is, it's really nice to have indoors. And just another picture of it, in full tilt bloom. Really good, rugged plant. Sedum kamchaticum. There are a lot of sedums that are really good, okay? This one is mostly evergreen, okay? And it wants to be kind of a rounded perennial. So it gets up to 5 inches tall, but that's really more the core. But it does kind of slowly move on out. And when it stays up in winter, it takes on a bronzy tone to it. There is another one that is more evergreen. It's not in this group, but just so you know to look for it. It's called Weinstephaner Gold. It's named after a village in Germany. And it also is low, but it truly is evergreen. So the sedums work super well in very dry soils. Where I experimented with them was in the front of my house where I have a dry stack stone wall. And you can imagine with a dry stack stone wall, right by where the wall is, those rocks, the soil is super fast draining, and not a lot of plants want to live in that zone. But the sedums do really well. I experimented with 6 different sedums, and the Weinstephaner Gold actually was the keeper out of all of them. But this one is really good. A nice clear yellow flower in the springtime, and then it will off and on give you sporadic bloom over the course of the summer. The sedums as a group have their leaves are thick, they're succulent. Essentially, they are modified water storage or organs. So even when you just get a little bit of rain, these absorb it and hold it. And so they're really able to do a good job in really dry situations. And then this is just it, you know, in a rocky area, and in a spring bloom, really nice spring bloom. This is an interesting one. This has gone in and out of favor. I really like this plant a lot. This is Sweetbox, Sarcococa hookeriana variety humilis. It can get up to 2 feet tall. It's evergreen. It is considered a ground cover, but again, so this is going to be about 2 feet tall. It blooms in the early spring, like March. So this is a really nice plant to have maybe by a back door in an area that doesn't get a lot of light, because this plant really wants to be in shade. Its leaves are a nice deep green, but those flowers, which are held underneath for the most part, you can see them because as they do fill out and spread out, you know, they show up underneath those gorgeous, glossy, deep green leaves. Really fragrant. So really nice to have by a door in a shady area. At a time of year when not a lot is happening yet. So, you know, it just kind of, it invites your senses to engage early on in the spring. And this is just showing you the glossiness and the texture of these leaves. It's a beautiful, beautiful plant. And it was probably 18 years ago, it was used a lot. And then it seemed to fall out of favor. And now I'm seeing it get used a lot again. I think it has an awful lot going for it. And it's very worthy of being used as ground cover in a shady area. Okay, now we're getting into the vines. This is Clematis integrifolia. This is more of a scrambler. It could be trained onto a fence or onto a low trellis. It doesn't really want to get much more than 4 feet tall. If you allow it to be in a planting of other plants, it becomes what they call a weaver plant. It will very gently work its way around some of the other plants, really kind of knitting the situation together. It's blue to violet in its flower color, and it blooms May into June. And sometimes, if you're lucky, if it's had enough moisture over the course of the summer, you will get a rebloom at the end of the summer, which is really quite nice. You got to love those plants that will come back and give you another hurrah. And just another picture of it from earlier in the day. And then this is what most people think of when they think of clematis. Some people call it clematis, some call it clematis. I tend to go back and forth on it, depending on who I'm talking to. Clematis henryi. This has a beautiful white flower. This is taken in my garden, and I love it when it's in bloom. It blooms in June, and sometimes I get a sporadic rebloom at the end of the summer if we've had a moist summer. This year we didn't have a moist summer. We were moist up until middle of June, which was great for the flowers, but it didn't give me a rebloom this year. It blooms on both old and new wood. So if you feel like it's starting to get too big, it can be cut back without really worrying about losing too much of it. The flowers on it are seriously, they are this big. So it really makes quite a statement in the garden. And it does have a little bit of fragrance, but not much. You have to be right up on the plant if you're going to be able to smell that. Just a close up. I mean, it's just a beautiful, beautiful plant. This is a native. This is Carolina jessamine, Gelsemium sempervirens margarita. And this blooms in the early part of spring. So a lot of times February, if we've had a mild winter, it'll start blooming in February. This is a full sun to part shade plant. It's pretty much evergreen. It holds the majority of its leaves over the course of the winter. So it still has a presence, which is really quite nice. The leaves are a really nice dark green, which, and I will get to your question in just a moment. The leaves are really dark green, which then causes those flowers to really pop off. And it's all plants, all parts of this plant are toxic. So a lot of pollinators will come to this because it's an early bloomer for them. But this is not something that you want to put in a garden with my crazy almost 2-year-old dog because she samples everything. And so you just got to keep problems like that away from a dog like that. Okay, there's a question.
Yes. Adriana asked, how long does clematis live?
How long does clematis live? Well, that's a really good question. I think it depends on the preparation of the site. I have a blue clematis. It was General something, might have been Sikorsky, that I took a cutting from my house before I moved, and it has been in the ground for 24 years, and it's still going strong. Mind you, my henryi, it's probably been around for 15 years, but I had planted another one called Hagley Hybrid because I like the name and the provenance, because Hagley is a museum near us. It's a DuPont estate, and it didn't last 2 years. I think it does need a humusy soil. It does not want to be wet. It needs to be well drained. So that being said, I mean, I've got one that is living from a cutting for 24 years. So I think it can run the gamut. I think soil preparation is really important. And there is a saying with the clematis that they want to have their head in the sun and their feet in the shade. So what I did with mine was I planted lavender on the sunniest side of it because lavender doesn't take a lot of nutrients, and yet it creates this shaded area for the root system of the clematis.
Thank you. I'm asking because I cannot tell when a perennial has outlived its life versus I'm doing something wrong. It's really hard to tell. I inherited, it came with a house, the clematis, but it's become a little less beautiful as
So
I took over. But so I don't know if it's an old one or I have to kind
so
of study it. Yeah.
so if it is one that you like, what I would recommend that you do is take one of the branches of it and put it on the soil, like bring that one down and maybe even put a stone on top of the branch and leave it there. Leave it there for 2 years. It will more than likely root in.
Mm.
And that's actually how I did the cuttings that I brought from my old house. I basically layered it onto the soil, and by the time I was ready to move, it took a year. It took a year because we knew we were going to be moving, but we didn't want to sell our house until our youngest had graduated high school. So I had a year to plan for that, and it did, and it worked really well.
So I have to be patient, huh? I'll tell you in 2 years how it worked.
Okay, please do.
Thank you.
You have my email. Any other questions? All right, moving on. So again, this plant is toxic. Always keep that in mind. But it is glorious when it is in full tilt bloom, and it blooms for a good 6 weeks. Really, a really nice, reliable spring bloomer. You just can't have it around pets. And then the Lonicera sempervirens, and I specifically chose Major Wheeler. I like all of the trumpet honeysuckles, but as far as the average garden, this one is more compact, okay? This wants to get about 8 feet tall. I'd say 8 to 10. And at the base, it can get 3 to 10 feet across, depending on how much room you give it. Like if you put it on a fence, you can count on it covering 10 feet of fence. I have it in 2 places. One is going over a large kind of wire arbor. And now I've got to cut it back every year just to keep it fresh. And because it really, once it gets going, it goes and it blooms for a long, long time, starting in the spring and then sporadically off and on all through the summer. And sometimes it will bloom into fall. And I even have one, the first one that I got, I put in a container on my deck because I couldn't figure out where I wanted to plant it. And that poor thing has lived in that container for, it's probably going on 10 years now. So I couldn't figure out where I was going to put it. And it blooms reliably as long as I give it fertilizer because it's in a container, right? So the nutrients in a container are going to wash away over time. The one that's planted in the ground in the backyard, I don't fertilize it. When I planted it with compost, and it just goes and goes and goes. And it is a hummingbird magnet. There are some other trumpet honeysuckles, like there's one called Alabama Crimson. And if you've got a bigger space that you want to cover, Alabama Crimson can get to 20 feet. Okay. There's a yellow blooming one called John Clayton. I have John Clayton as well. I've got it on the side of the house. John Clayton wants to be between 15 and 20 feet. Okay. Very reliable bloomers. And I just can't say enough about them. They do not have a fragrance. It's the Japanese honeysuckle that has the fragrance. This does not. but I'll tell you, it more than makes up for it with the length of bloom and the gorgeousness of the blooms. Yeah, see, I mean, it really looks like that. It's amazing. Now, we're coming to the end, and I want to just touch on water. Things for you to know for yourself and to explain to your clients. With the perennials, really, they need to be paid attention to for 1 full year. And summer typically being the most difficult time of the year for them. For the trees and shrubs, 3 years, okay? And if you're trying to establish something in a mature tree root zone, it's going to take you longer. So for perennials, if you were trying to establish ferns and sedges in the mature root system of a maple that's notoriously thirsty, you are going to have to pay attention to that plant in the summer for at least 2 years. Once it gets its feet, once it gets situated, it's going to be just fine, okay? But it's that paying attention to it. And a lot of times homeowners, they may think about it for 2 years. 3 years is where we get into trouble. And it really is important making sure that these plants get off to their best start. So make sure that you're educating your people. And this is more difficult to do, watering the soil and not the foliage. So this is your big friend, a watering wand. Now I've got a short one for up on my deck because my husband has very nicely on the deck, which is 2nd story. He has set up a hose situation for me so that I don't have to be going in and out with a pitcher of water to water my containers on my deck. I use the small wand. The longer wands are really what you want to encourage your homeowners to use. And or down in the corner, that right-hand corner, there's a tree gator. If they're planting a tree, for some people, it's easiest to, yeah, I see your comment. So sprinklers aren't our friends. Yeah, I'm getting into that. Okay. The tree gators for some people can be even more of a help because all they have to do is fill that bag twice a week and then they've watered the tree. Now, what I tell people to do, if you're doing small plantings, small-ish plantings, really you want to use a watering wand if you can help it, because the diseases, the funguses and bacteria move in a film of water. And even like with where we are in Pennsylvania, Delaware, we get really hot and humid in the summer, and there may not be a lot of rainfall, but that humidity collects on the leaves in the form of dew. And it's what allows things like powdery mildew to spread through a plant or bacterial leaf spot to move through a plant. So while we cannot control the amount of moisture that comes down from the sky, we can control where we are directing the water. And so that's why I'm bringing this up. Okay, so sprinklers, they make it easy to water a bed. Okay, if a whole big bed has gone in, probably that's the way you need to do it. Okay. And each time that you are putting down water, you want to be putting down about 1 inch. How do you know if you've put down 1 inch? Well, if it's a sprinkler or if you're using a soaker hose, you take a tuna fish tin or a cat food tin, which is about 1 inch deep, and you put it out there to monitor just how long it takes to get that amount of water down there. With the watering wand, what I do is say this is, I'm going to hold up my phone. Say this is my plant, and I'm going to put the tin out here. I'm going to use the watering wand, and I'm going to work my way around the plant, and I'm going to do it in just kind of a regular rhythm until I have hit that tin enough times to fill up an inch of water. And I will tell you that it really doesn't take very many tries of doing that to get the feeling for putting down an inch of water. So sometimes we can't help but use a sprinkler. It's not ideal, okay? It's just not ideal because of what I said with anytime you wet the foliage, you are creating the potential for there to be diseases that move in there. But sometimes it's just the only way to do it. And I will tell you that when we go into drought in this area, I will put the sprinkler on for about a half an hour at the base of trees. And I will do that once a week. We'll move the sprinkler around one day to the next to the next. The best time of day to water plants is in the morning. If you're not able to do it in the morning, you want to do it as early in the evening as you can. Again, so that moisture isn't sitting on the leaves. When you water plants in the morning, they go into the day already hydrated. So you're getting them off on their best foot, if you will. I think that's all. Yeah, that is all I have for you today. That's from my driveway. That's what it looked like about 2 weeks ago. Everything's looking really tired at this point, and it's time for me to cut these things down. But anyway, any questions?
Nope.
No?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Have a
Thank
great week, and I'll
you.
see you next week.
Great. You too. Thank you.
Mhm.